Welcome to Embargoed, a podcast featuring intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade for trade nerds and normal human beings alike. I am one of your hosts, Brian Fleming. I'm here as always with my friend, colleague, and co-host, Mr. Tim O'Toole. What is up, Tim?
What is up, Brian? Happy summer, happy hot summer, happy vaccinated summer. We're finally in the same location, although different rooms at this point for sound and technical reasons.
Yeah, we're back in the same location, so that's a step in the right direction. We had an actual in-person meeting, a lunch meeting earlier today, so at a downtown DC restaurant, one of our favorites. And now we are doing a little Monday afternoon pod recording. So I feel like this is progress,
Totally.
modest progress, but progress nonetheless.
We're beating
thanks everyone
the COVID.
Yeah, well, yes, being vaccinated is a good thing. We're beating the COVID. We thank you everybody for joining us as always, and thanks to everybody for comments, feedback since the last episode. We've taken a 3-week break, so a lot happened. We're not going to touch on everything that has happened in the month of June, but we do have a few juicy bits to cover, I think, in the next hour or so. And then I think we are going to hold true to our promise next time. I think we are going to have some guests. We're going to sort of tease some of the topics we're going to cover with them the next go round in July. But for today, it's a pretty traditional episode. Like I said, we're going to catch up on some of the things that we haven't been around to discuss the last few weeks while we've been scattered to the winds. But now here we are, late July. This will go up right before, or late June. This will go up right before the 4th of July holiday weekend. So if you have a long road trip, hopefully this will give you some accompaniment when you're on your way to hopefully someplace nice and warm and sunny to have a cold beverage and spend some time with friends and family. So before we get started, of course, the normal disclaimers: we're not giving legal advice, we're not discussing any confidential information. Any and all opinions that you hear today are mine and Tim's. Please blame us if you disagree with anything you hear from us. And if you enjoy the pod, please subscribe. You can find us anywhere you get your pod content. Please leave us a rating, hopefully a 5-star rating. Spread the word. Let everybody know about Embargoed. And with that, let me just run down quickly what we're going to cover today, and then we can get right into it. So we can't help ourselves. We're going to start with some non-news, which is the latest on JCPOA 2.0 and whether or not it is in fact actually now in a bit of jeopardy, and whether it is or is not going to happen. We're going to start with that. We'll probably hit that pretty quick, but that's what we're going to start with. We're then going to pivot to Belarus and the actions that came out about a week ago, coordinated between US, UK, EU, notably, and Canada, with respect to Lukashenko and the events that we covered a couple of episodes ago. We're then going to move to China. We're going to talk about one of our favorite topics, the TikTok ban and the official end of the TikTok ban and the new executive order that officially rescinded that and that has now stood up a new process that will be unfolding in the next few months to look at the threats posed by Chinese apps. And then lastly, we're going to talk about forced labor and some recent actions that were targeting Xinjiang once again, entity list additions from last week, and a few other actions that we're going to cover in more detail on the next episode. And then the lightning round, 2 quick topics. One is recent decision relating to the lawsuit that was brought by Oleg Deripaska, challenging his OFAC SDN listing and the outcome there. And then finally, some general licenses and other guidance that was just issued by OFAC relating to COVID relief, in particular to heavily sanctioned countries. So that's going to be our show for today. Tim, before we get started, any reflections, any thoughts, any comments before we dive in?
So every single segment today is just a continuation of old segments. It's like a soap opera. We keep having kind of these themes, or maybe like Real Housewives or something like that, where there's these themes and you
below deck.
below deck. We're going to talk about Captain Lee at some point again, but not today. But I have faith that we will, because every episode we talk about these stories that run and continue, and there is a theme and there is a narrative, and today is just all part of life's rich pageant.
Everything old is new again, and in the world of sanctions and export controls,
It's
nothing
true.
ever really dies or goes away. It just kind of morphs and
Exactly.
mutates and leaves us to continue to ponder and discuss. So, without further delay, let's start with topic number one. As I said, I think we want to spend just a few minutes at the outset here checking in once again on the fate of JCPOA 2.0, as we have dubbed it. I think there are a few developments in the past couple weeks since we've been away that are worth highlighting and that are potentially concerning to those who may have been certain that this was in fact going to happen, that there was going to be a deal. So, first and foremost, of course, there was the election in Iran, and the Ayatollah's handpicked candidate, Ebrahim Raisi, was the victor. Many calling the election rigged. Quite frankly, I'm so tired of listening to people talking about rigged elections. It's hard to stomach at this point. But that is the accusation coming from the West, that Raisi was essentially preordained to be the victor here. He is a hardliner. He is a cleric, former head of the Iranian Supreme Court, and a close confidant and protege, as I said, of the Ayatollah. So he is going to take control, take the reins of government in about 6 weeks as we sit here now in August. So it's late June. So that's pretty significant for a few different reasons. Apart from that, we have continued to see reports um, from various sources, from the Iranian side, from other places, claiming that a deal has been reached and everything is hunky dory and is going to proceed swimmingly. The U.S. has now, I think, made very clear that there is no deal as of now, and there is perhaps time is really running out to reach a deal for a variety of reasons. There has been more noise and more concern raised because the IAEA's monitors have not been allowed back in and are not being given access to certain information that they have requested regarding some of the nuclear sites in Iran. Comments from Secretary Blinken and others at very high levels of the U.S. On the U.S. side have made great pains to make clear that look, there could be the Iranians could go too far in terms of what they're doing to progress their program, their nuclear program, to sort of walk this all back, even if we can get to a theoretical deal. And when they cross that line, I don't know, but they might be getting dangerously close. And then, uh, yeah, there's, I would say, a decidedly more pessimistic tone from the U.S., I think, than we've seen since this really started. There have been 6 rounds of talks that just the 6th round just ended last week without a result, without an outcome, without a resolution. There will be a 7th round at some point soon, but as of now, I believe they're off at the moment. So that's kind of what's happening at the moment. And now I will start before I throw it to Tim. I will say, of course, there could be, there's a lot. There's also, of course, still a lot of um, concern on the U.S. side about, well, but I thought we were trying to get a better deal. What are we doing here? What's the strategy? What's the end game? How are we're gonna lose all our leverage over the Iranians if we go back and we lift sanctions and we kind of go back to the status quo from the pre-Trump pullout of the deal. And the Israelis, of course, are now more involved in part because they've had a change at the top of their leadership, and there's sort of new voices there that are of course indicating their displeasure with a potential deal, but also I think more willing to engage with the U.S. to discuss these things at least. So the soup here has gotten a lot murkier, I would say, in the last few weeks. And I think this next window here before Raisi takes power is critical and may in fact be really kind of the last gasp here. And if this doesn't get done in the next month plus, it's hard to see how it will get done because the U.S. is certainly at least representing that they're ready or willing to walk away if this doesn't get done soon. So, given how kind of consequential this is in the grand scheme of things, and the fact that this is still kind of bullet point number one in U.S. sanctions policy, we figured we would start here. Let me just throw it to Tim to get some of his initial reactions on sort of how he's reading all of this and what we expect, and anything else.
So, I mean, I'll start by just cautioning that we're reading the tea leaves based on, basically public sources. And but I
We
that
actually
having
have
been
a we
said,
actually have a mole in Vienna that is feeding us. No,
and our mole in Vienna that is feeding us raw
just
data
kidding.
about
Just kidding.
negotiating.
Just kidding.
Mr. Putin, if you're listening, no, sorry, that's not our mole in Vienna. So basically, I started by cautioning that because I do think it's important not to read too much into this, because people are speaking for public consumption in ways that they think further their interests behind closed doors, and so it's not necessarily what you're hearing in the media is exactly what's going on. But I think that a couple of things have changed in the last few weeks. One is I do think there's more urgency to finish this before Raisi takes office, which is about another month, as I understand it. And what I'm reading out of Iran is that he really doesn't want to be responsible for this deal if it goes bad. But the supreme leader is still supportive of going back into the JCPOA, and since the supreme leader really calls the shots in Iran, that's still what the Iranians want to do. But that Raisi would prefer that it not have his name on it, and that it have Rouhani's name on it. And so I think that there is a decent chance that that if they're going to do the deal from the Iranian side, it's going to be with Rouhani and not with Raisi, which means that the deadline is coming up for Iran to sign off, and that they may go off in a different direction if Raisi becomes president. Not 100%, but that's what I'm hearing, and it makes some sense. So that adds some urgency. I think from the U.S. side, the U.S. is a little bit conflicted, because I think that on the one hand, the U.S. is still very committed, and we've seen it in many of the other sanctions policies, to making peace with our friends in the European Union, to furthering their interest in the name of strong alliances. And the European Union still, from everything that I've read and seen, and really over the past 3 years, everything that the European Union has done, they support this deal and want this deal to come back into place. And so from that perspective, the U.S. is still really on board. What you said about Israel, I think, is very important, because Netanyahu had turned this into a partisan issue, and really when he went and gave a speech to Congress, kind of blasting the deal that President Obama was making at the time, that turned it into an issue where the Democrats, to some extent, were not as concerned about what the Israelis thought, because they had thought that Netanyahu had turned it into a political issue. The new leadership in Israel seems to be kind of doing what you do when you're in a real alliance. You go behind closed doors and you work these things out with your friends. You don't try to embarrass them in public. And so, at least as I understand it, the new Israeli leadership has some of the same concerns that President Netanyahu did, but it's raising them in a way that is much more likely to get the attention of the Biden administration and create some conflict in that administration in terms of whether we go with our European alliance and what they've wanted to do, or whether we actually put the interests of the Israeli government, the expressed interest of the Israeli government, further ahead, which would mean a smaller chance of getting into this deal. And so I think that does create some confusion, probably not enough to scuttle the deal on its own, but it is taking a long time. And we've talked about this on the podcast before. From the U.S. perspective, time has never really been the Biden administration's friend, because the nuclear deal expires. Parts of it expire in 2025, parts of it expire in 2030, and given the ticking clock, the longer it takes to get into a deal, the less time the Iranians are bound by the terms of the deal. And so, but the sanctions relief does not go away, and so basically you would be giving sanctions relief every day that passes. You're getting less and less in return from the Iranians, and so as the clock ticks, you get less from the U.S. side with respect to this deal. So time it creates a weaker incentive for the U.S. to really want to return to this deal. So I think all of that is playing in to make it seem a little bit less likely. Now, that said, when you step back from it, it's June, and the same concerns that we talked about in May are still really animating things. And that is that the Iranians, at the end of the day, I think want back into the deal. The U.S. at the end of the day wants back into the deal, and the Europeans want back into the deal, because nobody likes this situation where the Europeans are really bearing the brunt of the secondary sanctions that are the subject of the deal. The Iranians are bearing the brunt. Europeans don't want them. The Iranians don't want them. And the U.S. really never wanted to implement them in the first place. If the Biden administration certainly wouldn't have restored the secondary sanctions that the Trump administration did on its own. That, to me, is the motivating dynamic, is you have three parties that want to make a deal, and they probably will. But we've seen recent signs that throw that into a little bit of doubt.
Yeah, and I'll also add the one big thing too is that the idea that they could reach agreement to essentially get back to, again, status quo, kind of pre withdrawal from the deal in 2018. That's one thing, but I think there is going to be a lot of pressure on the U.S. certainly just domestically to do better than that, obviously, and to Tim's point, either extend the timelines, extend the reach of this, extend the breadth, extend uh, the type of promises that the U.S. can extract, whether it relates to ballistic missiles or other conduct of concern from the U.S. perspective with regard to the Iranians. And it's a little unclear sort of how you get there from here to some degree. I mean, there is certainly going to be there are going to be ample sanctions that are not going to be touched by anything that would be agreed to by the U.S. to get back in. Obviously, there will be there will still be, in theory, plenty of leverage to be wielded to get to that next phase. Let's say, if we can get back in the door, then what does the next phase look like? But again, there's it's going to take a little bit of a leap of faith to say, okay, well, let's just get in to this kind of back to the status quo, or to back to square one again, essentially to the deal we'd struck 6 years ago. And then we're going to hope that over the course of the next 2 years, 3 years, whatever it is, we can get to that next phase that's going to be really the next level, higher order, more impactful piece perhaps from the US side. So that's, again, is the will there, or is the sort of the handicapping of whether that's even possible? Is that eroding? Is that falling away? It's really hard to say. I agree with Tim that you have to take all of this with a grain of salt, but it does. But again, now that we have the newly elected leader of Iran, who's set to take power, who's the handpicked, person, steward by the supreme leader in Iran, I think now the clock is really ticking, and I think we are coming up to sort of the 0 hour here in terms of whether this is going to happen or not. And I think it may not be by the next episode that we record, but I would imagine that by the end of July we will know in all likelihood, one way or the other, whether this is really going to happen or not. So anyway, we wanted to do a quick check in there because there have been some dark clouds on the horizon here with JCPOA 2.0, and we did think it was, given how important it is and how much time is being invested in this across the globe, it seemed like a worthwhile topic to lead things off. So with that, let's shift gears to, I think, another very important topic, and another topic that Tim hinted at a key theme I think that we're going to touch on here, which is again sort of building bridges and working collaboratively with our friends in the EU in particular, and that's Belarus and the new sanctions that were just announced with respect to Belarus last week. So let me toss
Yeah.
that to Tim.
So the Belarusian action that took place last week is both a continuation of a segment that we had a few weeks ago on the podcast, where we talked about the forced diversion of a commercial Ryanair flight between Greece and Lithuania. Uh, that flight was forced out of the air and made to land in Belarus, at which point journalist Roman Protasevich and his girlfriend Sofia Sapega were taken off the plane and into custody, as we understand it. Obviously, the European Union is very upset by that. It's already taken some unilateral action, but last week, the United States and the European Union and Canada and the United Kingdom took multilateral action. So, again, the continuation of the Biden administration's theme of multilateral sanctions are usually the best way to go, and particularly when they are in response to an action that took place in the heart of Europe. I mean, within the territory of the European Union. And so, what was announced was that the State Department and a number of other agencies around the world imposed travel restrictions on a number of members of the Belarusian government. But in addition, OFAC actually designated 16 individuals and 5 entities. I mean, some of these were very high up in the Belarusian government. There were also in the Belarusian security forces, and then there were also entities that were basically state-controlled entities that were, at least as according to U.S. officials, were part of the either the violent crackdown that's been going on since the fraudulent August 2020 election, in which Lukashenko kept power, but there have been many protests since then, or involved in the arrest of the journalist and his friend. So basically, more on the same subject with respect to Belarus. This is the first real multilateral action in response to that we expected that it would be coming, and there it is. It's there, and it's really not a huge escalation. But I think what's important about it is the coordination with the allies and the fact that sanctions are at least one piece of the toolkit that are being used in response to this pretty shocking act.
Yeah, I think for me the big takeaway honestly is really the EU kind of leading the way on this, right? I mean, this was,
Yep.
and this is again very important and I think illustrative of the preferred approach of the Biden administration with regard to these types of actions. This was, again, to Tim's point, this is action that's occurring, involving multiple EU territories. And so it makes all the sense in the world that the EU would sort of take the lead on this. I think the consensus seems to be that and for those who aren't tracking this, the actions taken by the EU go beyond just kind of individual targeted sanctions. They are more sectoral sanctions in nature. They're targeting the banking, the oil and tobacco, and the potash industry, which is critical in Belarus.
Yep.
And those, I think, again, consensus seems to be that that is a real escalation in terms of severity on the part of the EU, and that's a sort of a welcome escalation on the part of the EU, and that the U.S., I think, to Tim's point, the U.S. has put a number of individuals who are part of the regime and entities, including some government entities like the Belarusian KGB, on the SDN list. And that was pretty much what we expected, I think, is that people that are sort of closely tied to and closely involved in the human rights abuses and other anti-democratic activities that have been going on in Belarus for quite some time, but it's certainly tracing back to last summer and then through the Ryanair flight. That was what we were going to see. I think the question that I would like to pose, sort of for everybody to think about, and for Tim, for you to ponder, is clearly the U.S. could do more, but I think, again, was in a coordinated effort, kind of let the EU take the lead on this to some degree in the first instance, or in this instance. So that's number one. So the U.S. I think could clearly do more, as we have talked about, and this was a fairly significant but relatively measured move on the part of the U.S. just in terms of exercising its own sanctions authorities. That's number one. Number two is, and I know this, and Tim, I know you know this from just having discussed this with people all around the world. When is it that Belarus is verging into the territory of a country that is now so severely um, compromised by, or the risks have been increased so much in terms of the sanctions that are targeted there that companies around the world are going to say, I'm just not doing business with Belarus anymore. I'm going to treat it like I'm going to treat it like an embargo country. I'm going to treat it like many treat, Venezuela or the more heavily sanctioned countries because the risk is just far outweighing whatever potential economic reward you might have. I can think of at least two or three companies that I've been in touch with just in the last couple of weeks who have said, we're basically putting Belarus on our blacklist. We're basically going to treat them like we treat North Korea and Iran and Syria, et cetera. So that's obviously very significant, and we're not anywhere close to really exhausting the authorities that could be deployed to target Belarus at this point. So that's my question to you, Tim: is that when is that? Are we at that tipping point right now, as it seems some might think, or do we think that there's more coming in this regard that might push us even further toward that?
So I'm getting the same sorts of questions, and I do think that from a client standpoint, from a public opinion standpoint, Belarus is getting to be a relatively heavily sanctioned country. I think in reality, when you look at what the sanctions are, on a scale of 1 to 10, with Iran and North Korea being the 10, and Cuba also probably being the 10, um, and Russia being a 7, and Venezuela being a 6.5. I think Belarus is probably about a 5, right there with Myanmar. I mean, there's a lot of room to go up. You could have a full-fledged embargo like some of the first countries that I talked about, and we're certainly not there yet with Belarus, but the risk is there. And I will say that the fact that the sanctions regime is multilateral and being led by the EU would make me really nervous. I think if President Lukashenko doesn't do anything outrageous going forward, that it probably, at least from the U.S. perspective, these will probably stop about where they are. But given his history, I think the chances of President Lukashenko not doing anything outrageous going forward are probably, low. And so that's why I think that companies that are being, risk sensitive are not too far out of the ballpark. The current situation is a 5, but one more act like this and it could get to a 7 or 8 pretty fast. They could pass Russia and Venezuela on the
Yeah,
the, the most heavily sanctioned
and
list.
if you're looking at something that's anything beyond just sort of a customer order here or there or something like that, if it's something more long term, if it's investment in country, things like that that are going to be potentially put in jeopardy if there's a further escalation here, then I think those are difficult kind of risk questions that you have to be wrestling with at this point, that I think people are wrestling with to the extent they haven't already made decisions on that yet. But I think now this has really brought that, it's kind of unavoidable. That's got to be dealt with at this point.
Yeah, I mean,
So
I view them as kind of Myanmar, Burma, in that area where the current sanctions are manageable if you're doing business in that country. I mean, it's just, you need to do electronic screening, and really, if you're dealing with the government, be very careful, but it's doable. But because the situation seems like it's trending bad and potentially trending really bad, from in a long, 6 month to couple year horizon, could be really ugly. And if you're worried about that, you might want to get out.
yeah, no, agreed. So anyway, that's food for thought. We'll keep our eyes on Belarus. I'm sure we may come back to that one again, because again, nothing in this world ever really dies or goes away. It just morphs and mutates. So I'm sure we will have more Belarus content in a future episode. With that, let's move away to one of our old favorites, which is China and TikTok. And so this one came up. This executive order came up not long after we recorded the last episode, actually. So this is a tiny bit stale, but we have not had a chance to talk about it on the pod as of yet. And given how much time we've devoted to this and the various lawsuits that came out challenging these executive orders, we felt like we had to circle back to this. So June 9th, it was announced that President Biden was issuing a new executive order protecting American sensitive data from foreign adversaries. And in particular, this was meant to, again, build on the ICTS supply chain executive order from 2019, the same one that was the underpinning of the TikTok and WeChat executive orders from last summer. But in the same breath of this executive order, the TikTok and WeChat executive orders, as well as one subsequent order that was issued in January of this year in a similar vein, were all revoked. And so this is, I think, our crystal balls we looked into many times on this one, and I think this is where we thought this was probably going to go, especially considering that these executive orders were essentially completely neutered by the court actions that came attacking them in the fall and never really got rolled out. And I think again, this is a theme, but the comments that you've seen, including from both of us in various publications, essentially said, look, I think nobody disputes or diminishes the threat that's posed by China or other foreign adversaries in terms of access to sensitive U.S. Data and data of U.S. persons in particular through software and other sort of applications, whether they be on smartphones or otherwise. And it's that problem, which is again not one that's really in a controversial one or in dispute, but it was the execution and the sort of the somewhat haphazard way that the Trump administration went about trying to get at that issue, throwing these executive orders together, which we covered at length last year. I'm not going to go back into that, but this is really a chance to kind of hit the refresh button on that and and just start over. And that is clearly what is happening here. And in fact, I think this is language that has been quoted in many different periodicals and many different articles on this, but there's a little passage in the executive order that says the federal government should evaluate these threats through rigorous evidence-based analysis and should address any unacceptable or undue risks consistent with overall national security, foreign policy, and economic objectives, including the preservation and demonstration of America's core values and fundamental freedoms. I think that pretty much sums up in the minds of the Biden administration and many others what the Trump administration did not do. There was no rigorous analysis. There was no process. There was no real there as we saw in these lawsuits and the way that they were the records that were furnished to defend them in court. And so that has now all been undone. And basically what we have in its place is a potential process led by the Commerce Department again to sort of look at this problem in more depth and to issue some reports. And those reports are going to go to the White House and to the president and his advisors. They're not necessarily going to go to Congress or to the public. So this is going to play out over the course of the next 4 months, 6 months, where they're going to take a look at these issues within the interagency process, again led by the Commerce Department, to really dig into these threats that are posed by, again, these adversaries who control or own connected software applications, and the threats that they pose to sensitive, U.S. person data. So there's not a lot of meat on the bones in terms of what that's going to mean, what that's going to look like, how that's going to play out, what kind of policy we're going to get out of this, what kind of process we may get out of this. Like, are we going to get a CFIUS-like process out of this? Are we going to get something else? I don't know. I don't think anybody really knows at this point. But the bottom line is what was put together with sort of spit and glue and popsicle sticks last year has now been thrown away, and we're starting over. And the idea is to build something on a more solid foundation to get at this very real national security issue. And I think that's sort of the broad takeaway I have, certainly from revoking these orders and issuing Executive Order 14034. And so that's really all we know at this point. I'll throw it to Tim just for some thoughts and comments, but this brings to the end at least this chapter of the saga. I'm pretty sad that I'm not going to be able to hashtag TikTok ban anymore, but other than that, I'm not really all that sad that this is going away.
So you said you weren't going to rehash over it, and I'm not going to rehash over it much, but I can't resist rehashing it over just a little bit, just to show why kind of these statements at 50,000 feet, where this is a more evidence-based approach, to bring those home to kind of illustrate exactly what you're talking about. So back in the day, the president started tweeting about how bad TikTok and WeChat were, and that things were going to happen to TikTok and WeChat. And that ultimately culminated in a process in which the Commerce Department and CFIUS were leveraged to force Oracle or force a process in which the president said that those companies had to sell, or that TikTok had to sell to a U.S. purchaser, and there were bids that were kind of orchestrated by the U.S. government. The president was making statements that the U.S. government was going to take essentially a commission on the deal. Oracle and Walmart won the bid to bid on this forced sale of TikTok, and then the deal was rejected. Like, I can't even imagine. Like, this seems like a different world, and the driving motivation for all of that craziness was supposedly that TikTok and WeChat, more than any other Chinese company, were such existential threats to U.S. personal data that it had to be done, and it had to be done in that particular way. And it just looked like such a fig leaf at the time that it almost brought into disrepute the idea that those companies really were some sort of a threat, because it just looked so insane. I think that is the atmosphere in which you have to look at the new Biden administration approach, and to say, I think they're trying to salvage it. I mean, look, the idea that TikTok and WeChat have it, like many Chinese companies, have some role in the harvesting of U.S. person data for reasons that the Chinese that only the Chinese government knows. Like, by all accounts, that's actually happening. Now, whether they're the two biggest offenders, I think a lot of people would dispute that, but that appears to be happening, or at least happening at some level with respect to Chinese companies and U.S. personal data. But the way that the prior administration went about dealing with that issue was so fundamentally ridiculous that that not only did this administration, not only did they lose in court, but I think this administration was forced to kind of take a deep breath before dealing with this issue, because they had brought that whole approach into such disrepute that you just basically needed a timeout and then you start over. And this is the timeout plus the starting over with an actual process that is not designed to get any particular company, not designed to force a sale to U.S. purchasers for a U.S. government backed commission or whatever that was, and hopefully we'll get to a good place, because the issue of the Chinese government and Chinese companies placing U.S. personal data at risk is a real issue that needs to be dealt with in a real way through a real process, as opposed to what happened before, which, even when I say it, it just seems so ridiculous that I can't imagine that it ever really happened.
Yeah, we're not meaning to make light, obviously, of the underlying issues at all. I mean, the entire CFIUS process was revamped by Congress in part to address this issue. So it is a real issue. It is not going away. But again, the manner and method and means that the prior administration took to try to achieve that obviously was a spectacular failure. And so here we are, about 6 months into the Biden administration with a full reset. And we've been seeing this kind of piecemeal. We just saw this with the 13959 that we talked about the last time, and the Chinese military industrial companies. To some degree, it's just a reset. It's sort of let's kind of tidy this up. Let's put a little more rigor and framework and process in place here so that it's sustainable and not just kind of it's something that works willy-nilly at the whim of whatever comes across the Twitter transom on a given day. So that is I think where we are with this, and it'll be, again, I don't know that we'll be talking about this one now again for a while, but at some point we will, because at some point there will be some actual, presumably concrete steps that are taken pursuant to whatever the deep dive is that's going to be done here, and the reports that are going to be issued.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a serious issue, and you need to deal with it in a serious way. And if you don't, I mean, we've now seen what happens. You can take 2 or 3 steps back because you bring the whole issue, you cast skepticism on the whole issue, and force people to go even slower than they might have had to otherwise. I mean, it is another example of kind of stop digging and then digging out of the ditch that was created.
Yeah, no doubt. So in any event, let's leave let's throw some dirt on the TikTok ban for now, and then let's move on to our final topic of the day, which is another China topic, and taking a look at a couple of actions that were announced last week targeting forced labor in Xinjiang. And I'll throw that to Tim.
So that's another continuing theme on our podcast is the U.S. response to forced labor in Xinjiang. I think that, um, you know, continuing with the Biden administration multilateral action theme, Xinjiang was a big topic of discussion at the G7 conference earlier this month over in Europe, and the U.S. has taken a number of actions, and this was an area in which the Trump administration and the Biden administration, I think, agree not only 100% on policy, but in many ways 100% on what to do about it. So, unlike the TikTok actions, unlike the 13959 actions, what the administration did with respect to the forced labor in Xinjiang and the human rights abuses in Xinjiang have been much more traditional. So, there was a OFAC sanctions program related to the Xinjiang. It was the result of a congressional statute on the same subject that was passed in the last year of the Trump administration. The Trump administration designated some individuals based on that program. And then earlier this month, the Biden administration kind of went one step further, marshaling three different agencies of the U.S. government: Homeland Security, the Department of Commerce, and the Department of Labor, all of which were announcing measures to essentially address the PRC human rights and use of forced labor issues with respect to Xinjiang. And from the commerce side, I mean, we'll just focus on those here, although there were some import issues, there were some labor investigations that were announced. But from the commerce side, 5 entities in the solar industry were placed onto the entity list, which means as a result of the entity list designation, those entities can no longer receive U.S. origin goods as mentioned on the entity list without a license from the Commerce Department. And so I think it's more of a symbolic step, but because I think, at least as I understand it, these are more in the supply chain. The Commerce Department side is more of a symbolic step. I think the import restrictions probably were more had more teeth, but we'll leave it to some of our guests at another point to talk about that, because we're much more on the export side than the import side. But the Commerce Department action was coordinated with U.S. agencies, and our allies from around the world are also taking steps on this issue. And so I think that this is one where it is a continuing issue. The approach from administration to administration has been relatively consistent and relatively serious, both in the last administration and in this one. And we'll see what happens going forward. But I think this is something to watch, because, as I understand it, the Chinese response to this was very aggressive and harsh, and that there will be counter sanctions coming out of China in response to this issue, but also some other sanctions with respect to China that had been announced in the last few months.
Yeah, I'll just make a few final comments on this. Again, I think we largely we are planning to have some of our some friends and colleagues on to talk more about the forced labor issues that we're seeing here with the big withhold release order that came out last week targeting the solar industry, and some other recent orders of the same ilk that are, we know, creating real havoc in a number of different industries globally, and certainly with ties to the U.S. And so I do think it's notable, as Tim said, that this is one area where there is pretty remarkable consistency between the Trump administration and the Biden administration. I think this is one area where it's fairly seamless, and I think you're seeing the branching out that we're getting to now. As Tim mentioned, there were some authorities that were put in place last year. There's obviously the Global Magnitsky Act that has been in place to target human rights abuses, and now we're seeing this as a standalone basis for these entity listings. Not the first time, but a relatively recent sort of justification for entity listings. You haven't seen that a lot historically, but certainly in the last couple of years you have. So I think it's just this is kind of again another sort of building block and another important continuation of that same theme that's being pulled through. I do think also similar to a point that we raised earlier, this is another issue where we know that anybody who has any ties to either this industry in China, solar in China, or certainly anybody who has ties to Xinjiang for any reason, because they have supplier relationships there, because they have manufacturing there, because they have any presence there, any ties there whatsoever. Um, this has now, I think, become one of the, if not the most kind of critical, time-consuming, and important issue to deal with from a trade compliance, business and human rights, standpoint, supply chain management standpoint, all of those things, right? It's all these things kind of tied together, married up, because this has such an incredible potential to disrupt business in a way that is, so just monumental, frankly. That I think we're seeing stories and hearing more about companies that are getting caught up in this because they have perhaps not moved as quickly as the U.S. government has wanted them to move to be out in front on this or to be prepared for things like this. And it's just a reminder that these things I think grow and spread quickly, and there have been signs obviously that this is going to continue to grow in these areas. And so for anybody out there that's wrestling with this and trying to figure out how to either disentangle themselves or, to Tim's point, how do you stay on the right side of the Chinese authorities if you try to back away from this quietly and not get yourself caught up the in some of the new Chinese regulations that are designed to, bully people into essentially ignoring the U.S. and other Western, sanctions and repercussions that are coming at companies that are doing business in this area. It's a very very tricky, very very time consuming issue that is just occupying all kinds of resources and brain space at many companies around the world at the moment, obviously. So I had two conversations about this earlier today. I know Tim has been talking about this with his clients a lot as well, but this isn't going away. This is only going to get worse, I think, and is only going to get more challenging. And so, like we said, we just wanted to highlight this most recent action. Of the five entities, I would note that XPCC, which was featured prominently in the OFAC action that was brought targeting Xinjiang last year. So they are now both in SDN and on the entity list. They were one of the five named entities last week. But this is again, this is not going away. This is just going to expand, I think, and continue to deepen in terms of the complexity here and the ability to continue to navigate it. If you're trying to walk that line of maybe we can get by without having to address it square on, I think it's becoming harder and harder to do that. This has become a very difficult one to manage at this point. So, in any event, we wanted to touch on that briefly. We wanted to highlight that, and again, we're teasing that for the next episode. We're hoping to have a more in-depth discussion on some of the other side of this coin, the sort of imports, customs, business and human rights side of this equation, supply chain management, and we're gonna, like we said, have a couple of guests on next time to talk about that, hopefully. So that wraps up the main part of our episode for today. And with that, we only have two final topics, which I will pause for our favorite sound effect, the lightning round. Topic number one is one that I believe we talked about at some point way back when this was perhaps not when it was first filed, but we wanted to raise an opinion that came down in DC about 2 weeks ago, which was a lawsuit that was brought by Oleg Deripaska, the Russian oligarch, and of course he was sanctioned on April 6, 2018, along with a number of others. And that was, of course, the inciting event that um, triggered all kinds of complications relating to EM Plus and Rusal and all of his other business interests, and a long process to try to for him to divest some of his holdings there to help get those companies out from under OFAC blocking sanctions. So he brought suit challenging his designation as an SDN under 13661 and 13662. I believe two of the Crimea-related EOs, and there was just an opinion handed down, like we said, about 2 weeks ago, fighting for the government, dismissing his claims, and getting rid of his challenge. So, we're doing this in the lightning round. We're not gonna wade into all of the ins and outs of this, but I will say a couple of things um, quickly on this, and then throw it to Tim. So one of the reasons we wanted to cover this is we've obviously been doing a lot of discussion lately about some of the federal court litigation that we've seen that has challenged various actions of the government, whether it be DoD or OFAC or other agencies of late. And we have seen quite a bit of success, quite frankly, perhaps more success than we are used to seeing in this sphere, a higher rate of success, at least, with some of these recent lawsuits. So we did think it was interesting to make note of this one, in part because this was an unsuccessful challenge, and we should say we know the attorney that brought this, and we have a lot of respect for him, and he's been very successful in many other of his attempts to bring suit against OFAC. So this is no black mark against him at all. This was always going to be an uphill battle, I think, in our view, as it normally is when challenging a designation of this sort. But essentially, at the end of the day, I think a couple quick takeaways, and I know Tim has some thoughts on this as well. One of the things that we were really have been focused on whether it was the Commerce Department justifications in the TikTok and WeChat lawsuits, or it was DoD when it came to the CCMC listings, was the real dearth of evidence that was in those administrative records to support the agency actions that were being challenged. And I think, as we have said many times, and as I think I will, stand by, and as anybody who reads the memorandum opinion in the Deripaska case will see, OFAC's just better at doing this, in part because they've been doing it a long time, and so they understand how to build a record when they are going to be adding somebody, when they're designating somebody on the SDN list, and under specific, reference authorities. They're just better at connecting those dots, building that record, having the support. I would note here, we were shocked in some of those other lawsuits that there was no reference whatsoever to classified portions of the record. Here, there was a classified portion of the record. Obviously, it's not being quoted in the opinion, but it's referenced, and it's pointed to by Judge Mehta as supporting the decision to dismiss the challenge. And so I think that's just number one. And I would say that this was, again, sort of the same type of bases that we see in these cases generally. That the listings exceeded the authority of OFAC, that they were arbitrary and capricious under the APA, that they were a violation of due process, all of the sort of same bases that we see typically in these cases. I think I would say that this outcome is not terribly surprising to me, given, again, the fact that we kind of thought this had long odds anyway, and again, just looking at how an OFAC supported designation is just, looks kind of fundamentally different, and perhaps is something that a judge looked at just less skeptically than, the Judge Contreras looked at some of those other designations in the CCMC cases, certainly. But that's not to say that this is a sign that all is lost in this vein, or that there's no prospect, I think, to successfully challenge these things. I just think that here, perhaps this is kind of the home team won, right? The expected outcome is what happened here. We didn't get if you're handicapping these things, if you're playing odds, a challenger to file a federal lawsuit here, you're not going to give them overwhelming odds most of the time. Here, I think this played out as we are, typically would see. Although I know, Tim, you have at least some question whether or not there was perhaps a little too much deference given to OFAC, given what was in the record and sort of the way it was all treated. But again, I think my main takeaway is this is one that maybe restores balance a little bit in the way of the sanctions force is deployed throughout the universe, because this one I think is much more of a what we're used to seeing as opposed to what we've seen in the last few months.
Yeah, I mean, so the Xiaomi litigation, the Lukong litigation, they were about a listing by a government agency, and the listing had severe consequences for the party listed. And in those two cases, the court took a look at the listing and the basis for the listing and concluded it was, I mean, this is not a technical legal term, but was basically a joke. That is very unusual, as we pointed out at the time, in federal litigation against a government agency, particularly in the national security context. Usually, what you get when you're challenging a government listing is a relatively deferential review of the government action, deferring to the government's national security powers, deferring to the fact that the government is really in the best position to assess a lot of classified intelligence information, and looking for something that was egregiously wrong. And if you can't show something that was egregiously wrong, you're really not going to have much of a chance. And the Deripaska case played like a perfect paradigm of the normal national security case. I think, my friend Eric Ferrari, who did a really nice job litigating this, had a really heavy load to bear in this case, because not only was he up against OFAC instead of being up against the Department of Defense in this context. And OFAC, as you point out, Brian, did a pretty nice job. I mean, they articulated some reasons that make some sense as to why you would do a listing if you have these criteria that were allowing for a listing. And I think Eric did as good a job as he could, but I think he did have a tough case because there were some bad facts with respect to Deripaska, or at least OFAC had made some findings of some bad facts, and I think most judges wouldn't be inclined to go behind them, as opposed to in the Xiaomi case, where the Department of Defense didn't really make many factual findings. I mean, there was essentially an agreement that if the term affiliated actually had any meaning, that they couldn't meet that definition. And and then, you had the misspellings, and they really didn't even have a memo at the time that the lawsuit was filed. It was like night and day in terms of you had an agency that was trying to do its job and got a lot of deference because of it, and an agency in the Xiaomi litigation that didn't even appear to be trying, and so didn't get nearly as much deference. In fact, got a very skeptical reception from Judge Contreras. Now, I also want to be delicate here because my friend Judge Maida, whom I worked with at PDS, I think did a nice job, and I think he probably got to the same result that I would have gotten to in this case. So so I'm not trying to be critical of the result, and I'm not even much critical of the analysis. I think there was more deference, as I was talking to you before we started recording, Brian, probably more deference than I think is warranted to some of these decisions, because, for example, one of the criteria for the listing was that that Deripaska was operating in the energy sector of the Russian economy. Query whether that is a sufficiently discrete category of people as to really ground a designation in, especially when I do think there was not sufficient not a sufficient recognition of what a significant sanction being put on the SDN list is. And again, I'm not claiming that it wasn't warranted in these circumstances, but it seems like, particularly in some of the sections talking about due process, that the severity of the injury was not grappled with sufficiently, and the agency's kind of expertise. Yes, they found, based on some actions that he took outside of Russia, that he was operating in the energy sector. And I think that was a little bit of a tenuous articulation of that type of designation. Now, being close to Putin and some of the things that he was alleged to have done with respect to Putin, I think was very different. And I think that, to me, if you were doing an analysis of what would get you, what could properly get you sanctioned and get upheld by a court, that looked pretty serious. And if any of that stuff is, even halfway true, and when you're reviewing an agency decision, if they had evidence for it and then they found that it happened, you have to presume that it is. That struck me as a much more solid ground. I mean, the other thing that I thought was that Eric did a nice job with in this case was going after the oligarch list, and I'm not sure. I thought the reception to that should have been more like Judge Contreras's reception to the DoD listing. I mean, it's one thing with respect to the Deripaska listing. So OFAC did have some. They laid out 6 different grounds for the listing, and I thought some were stronger than others, but some were pretty strong. The oligarch list, by all accounts, was just taken from Forbes and just reprinted. I mean, and it's been reported in the media quite a bit, and without much pushback that I've ever seen from the Treasury Department. And so that list seems like it was put together in a much less professional way, and there was much less thought put into it. And at least as I read the court's opinion, the response to that was, yeah, but so what? It's not that big a deal to be on the oligarch list. And it was kind of a lot of the harm from being on that list was poo-pooed because it supposedly isn't foreseeable that banks would stop doing your transactions if you're on that list.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's just wrong. That's just wrong.
Brian, that's just wrong. That's just wrong. I mean, you go on a list even if it doesn't. And again, that's also inconsistent with what happened in the Lukong and Xiaomi litigation, where part of their injury was reputational. I mean, they were claiming reputational injury from being on the 1359959 list, and Judge Contreras took those claims very seriously. Now, I did think the judge made a point at the very end of his analysis that really, for me, would have been the beginning and the end of it. It was if you're properly in SDN, you're not harmed by being on the oligarch list, because whatever harm you've got is
it flows from the other SDN list. Yeah, that's right. I thought that was odd. I thought that was odd too. Why end with that? Why not start with that? And then also,
to me, you don't need to come. And the end.
Yeah, you don't need to write 8 pages on this if that's your main point. Quite frankly,
right,
I think it's pretty straightforward.
It's like, the oligarch list is a joke.
Yeah,
but it was taken verbatim from Forbes. It does cause reputational injury if all you are is on the oligarch list, and you and I have both seen situations in which that's the case. It does cause severe reputational and, in some sense, financial industry for the people who are just on the oligarch list, who aren't on any of the other lists. For Deripaska, if he's properly on the SDN list, he's not really getting harmed much more by being on the oligarch list, because the SDN list has all of the reputational consequences plus a bunch of actual legal consequences that are much worse. And so it's hard to see where the additional harm is. So again, I'd get to the same place, but the idea that you're not harmed by being on the oligarch list, that's just not factually true. I mean, we have plenty of clients who banks stop their transactions, or who get transactions rejected or blocked because they are on lists like the oligarch list that don't have any legal consequence, but banks are so risk averse that they are they basically will stop transactions for things that are in the newspaper. And so if you're actually on a government list, even if it's not a list that has any meaning for a bank whatsoever, they are definitely at least some banks will attach consequences to the list, even if they aren't legal consequences.
Yeah, agreed. Also curious, I'm not aware that there have been any lawsuits that have just challenged the designation or addition to the oligarchs list just on its own, right? That are a separate, which is sort of an interesting, and in the same way, I don't think we would have ever seen lawsuits that challenged, CCMC listing if there hadn't also been 13959. It's just sort of the strange quirk of the way it kind of came together, and that's how it sort of grew. But yeah, your point is well taken. I think that's exactly right.
And again, Judge Mate is a great judge, and I thought he did a nice job here. And
we have nothing but love and respect for everybody involved in this. So please don't anybody accuse us of shading anyone who's involved here. But in any event, I think it was just we don't see too many of these, especially with somebody who's this high profile like Deripaska. It's sort of come down, and this one's been kicking around for a while, and the decision just came down. So we thought
we should see more of these. I think Deripaska is a really hard case, and it got to where I think I would have expected a really hard case to get. But there are cases that are more winnable than Deripaska's that are not ever brought and probably should be.
Agreed. Just takes the appetite to file that lawsuit. So with that, let's pivot to the final topic, which I'll throw to Tim, which is some recent OFAC general licenses and guidance relating to COVID relief to heavily sanctioned countries.
Yeah. One of the things that the administration did immediately after taking office was there was a National Security Memorandum 1, which directed all of the relevant government agencies to review U.S. and multilateral sanctions to evaluate whether or not they were hindering the response to the pandemic. And that had long been a complaint of sanctioned countries like Venezuela, like Iran. I think those are probably the two highest profile countries in which those had been really serious complaints. There were also complaints about the way that it was hindering the response to the pandemic in Syria as well. Although I think Venezuela, at least to my knowledge and based on my non-random sample of questions and inquiries that I get, Iran and Venezuela were more high profile. Now, the past administration had responded to that in several ways. The main one being that they put together kind of a compendium of authorities that would allow for exceptions to the sanctions against those countries that would allow for transactions related to COVID-19. And the US humanitarian transactions are generally an exception to most US sanctions programs, really all U.S. sanctions programs to some extent. And so this announcement on June 17th was not a huge news in the sense that when the Treasury Department issued 3 new general licenses, one for Iran, one for Syria, and one for Venezuela, to allow those countries to engage in even additional transactions to address the pandemic, it really wasn't much of a step beyond where U.S. law had gone before. I think the main purpose of these announcements was essentially to send a signal to financial institutions that they ought to be allowing more of these transactions to go through, because despite earlier actions by OFAC, I mean, the real resistance here, and it kind of plays into what we were just talking about with Deripaska, it's the banks. I mean, the banks, even these transactions that the Trump administration was saying, we're not trying to interfere with them, they weren't going through. And so I think what the Biden administration decided to do was, with respect to these 3 countries, issue 3 new general licenses. They lay out exactly in those general licenses what sorts of transactions are allowed despite the sanctions against Iran, Syria, and Venezuela. They do it in some detail. They have a frequently asked question that is directed at financial institutions that says, if they meet the standards in this transaction, you should let these transactions go forward. I think it's just another step to try and keep sanctions from interfering with COVID-19 related actions in these countries. So, in part, I hope, because the U.S. really wants to not interfere with pandemic-related measures, and in part, I think to make it very clear that those countries should not be blaming the U.S. for interfering in pandemic, measures. I think it's in part, substance, and in part, kind of trying to avoid blame.
Yeah, I mean, I think that just a couple of quick thoughts on this. To Tim's point, I think we covered the sort of compendium of sort of general licenses and exemptions that were available that were kind of rolled out early in the pandemic. I think we covered that in like episode number, I don't even know, 4 or 5, somewhere way back in like late March or April of last year. And I think the question and the comment that we had at the time, which is exactly what Tim just said, is like, how much difference is this really going to make? Because at the end of the day, it's the banks who decide, and the banks who have the risk tolerance that sort of drives all of this. And if they're not comfortable, kind of opening up to allow more humanitarian trade related to the COVID crisis to these types of countries, then it's just not going to happen. And obviously, we're aware that some of it has been happening certainly, but perhaps not enough. And I think to Tim's point, this is another effort, it seems, to sort of make this, to reduce that risk tolerance, or to sort of help that risk tolerance that is just so low for the banks, and make it that much more clear, and to make it clear for anybody who's in the who's supplying any of these items. I mean, there are now specific, there are specific items that are called out in these general licenses and in these FAQs where it's now very clear that previously you might need a specific license, now you don't. That's a pretty big deal as these things go, and a pretty significant step. And we certainly know from having clients who are in the not just in the financial industry, but in the you know on the side of providing some of these goods that might fall under these general licenses, that there has been a lot of perhaps willingness, but there has been a lot of difficulty, as sort of predicted at the outset, that this would be easier said than done to just sort of open the floodgates and let humanitarian trade flow from the U.S. or connected to the U.S. to these countries that are more heavily subject to U.S. sanctions. So we'll see. Hopefully, this will help things. Hopefully, this will make things better rather than worse. I think to Tim's point, I think a legitimate reason to, or a legitimate hope to kind of clear up some of that confusion and pave the way and open things up. But to Tim's point as well, I think from an optics standpoint, the last thing that the U.S. wants to be accused of is being kind of obstructing this, whereas I think under the old administration, I don't know that they cared all that much when it came to certain countries, but I think certainly this administration does care about that, and I think it's part of the broader narrative and the broader fabric that they're trying to weave in terms of, again, building bridges with old allies and trying to make new allies, et cetera. And so I think this all is of a piece with that, and it does make sense at this point that something like this would be rolled out.
Yeah, I think it's genuine. I think it'll genuinely help. A general license that's directed specifically at COVID relief, and as you point out, has the specific mentions of types of equipment that were, not obviously covered by earlier humanitarian exceptions, is a good thing. And I think that the FAQ guidance that they gave in conjunction with this, particularly the one that's directed right at the financial institutions, is basically, when you're trying to get a transaction through, as we know, and you're dealing with a bank, being able to point to a specific GL and to be able to point to specific guidance helps a lot more than being able to than pointing to a particular memo, right?
Or a
Right?
definition of something and
Or a
say, no, 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 we are
definition,
covered by this because this falls under this category.
right?
Well, go to OFAC and
So I think it'll help.
tell them to confirm that for us. Okay, good luck with that. So in any event, okay, so that's I think, yeah, I agree. Not to take off my cynical hat and to put on my let's see the good in mankind. I think I agree. I think this is probably a net benefit for a win-win all around for everybody, hopefully.
You
So
play Candide for a day.
yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for to playing us out on that. And with that, I think we're done for this week. We're wrapped up and again, heading into, we're recording this on June 28th. We're heading into the Independence Day holiday weekend here in the U.S. This will be out late this week. We are planning to be back in a couple weeks again with some guests to talk, I think, a lot more about business and human rights, especially as it relates to China and all of the actions, some of which we touched on here, but others of which are swirling around and causing great disruption and consternation around the world. So we're hoping for that in mid-July. And with that, I think, Tim, anything else to ride us out, or any final thoughts?
We live in the best of all possible worlds, Brian. So stay sanctions free.
Stay sanctions free. Thanks, everybody. See you next time. Bye.